This is a story that pops up in my mind from time to time. I've only told it to a few people, but I definitely feel like it deserves its place here. It is for sure one of the scariest moments I've ever had as a child. Back when I was around 10 years old, my mom finally decided that it was time for her to start taking her driver's license test. When she began taking lessons, she was struggling a lot. For that reason, my dad decided that he wanted to do some practice with her, besides the official driving lessons with her instructor, just to make sure she'd pass the upcoming test first try. My little brother and I were attending swimming lessons at the nearby university at the time. Behind a forested area near the university lies a huge student parking area surrounded by trees, which turned out to be basically empty every weekend. My dad saw the opportunity to take my mom here to drive around for a bit, and brought my little brother and I since we were too young to stay home alone. We brought a football with us as well. When we arrived at the parking lot later in the evening, my parents began their practice. My little brother and I quickly got bored though, and asked if we could go over to this little grass field on the side of the parking lot and play some football. My parents let us as they'd be able to keep their eyes on us while driving around. After playing for some time, my parents ended up driving around in the other end of the parking lot. They were approximately 400 meters away from my brother and I. Suddenly, this white Toyota pulls up into the parking lot. We were playing almost right at the exit or entrance. The car turns around and stops on my right side with the vehicle facing the exit. The driver rolls down his window and presents himself as Thomas. He looked friendly and was quite good looking and young. I guess he maybe would have been around 30. This is where things started to get weird. On the passenger seat was a woman covering her face with a newspaper. All I could see was long blonde hair, and on the back seat was a baby sat in a baby chair. Thomas immediately states that he's from the police, and that we have to get in the car immediately as he has to have a talk with us. My brother actually took 2 steps towards the vehicle, but I stuck my arm out in front of his chest as I was sensing something was off. The woman was still covering her face at this point, not saying a word. Thomas then raised his voice and told us again to get into the car, or else he would have to come out and get us. My brother and I froze out of fear. Suddenly, the woman put down the newspaper, showed her face, and told us in the most calm and motherly voice to just listen to the man. The woman looked young, pretty, and like a person who wouldn't hurt a fly. At this moment, I began screaming as loud as I could. What we hadn't already seen at that point was my dad was already running as fast as he could towards us. My parents didn't have time to drive to us since the road down the parking lot was twisted all the way. When my dad heard my scream, he started yelling as loud as he could, asking who they were and to get the F away from his children. As soon as Thomas heard my dad and realized my brother and I weren't alone, he threw his car into gear and took off as fast as he could. He most definitely looked like a person who nearly shit himself when he saw my dad. My dad was furious and told my brother and I to hurry up back into the car. He didn't even think about calling the police at that point. He just wanted to beat up the guy himself. That resulted in us driving around for the next hour, trying to find him before my dad cooled down and decided he should probably just call the police. We never found out who those people were, but this episode taught me never to judge a book by its cover. People can be the most friendly-looking people in the world, and still wish evil upon you or the ones you love. I'm not sure what these people would have done to us, but I'm definitely sure about one thing. They definitely were not from the police. I'm a 21-year-old girl taking her first backpacking trip around the world. I only arrived in Thailand 2 days ago, and it was unfortunate as I almost got kidnapped on my first night. I went to Bala Road, which is well known, and had a few beers at a bar, and then went to the popular club, Illusion. I was having a good time, dancing and meeting people. In the club, I only had 3 drinks. But at some point, I realized I was a lot more drunk than expected. I don't know if I was spiked, but I was dumb and had my drink on the table next to me while I was dancing, and it was very crowded. In total, over the space of 3 hours, I only had 2 beers and 3 tequilas. Usually, that's an okay amount for me to be aware. I went to the bathroom and felt very intoxicated and threw up. Upon leaving the bathroom, a guy who I did not know grabbed my arm. He seemed young, and I asked him what he was doing. He said he wanted to help me down the stairs. After we got down to the road, he dragged me down an alleyway and put me in his car. I was really scared at this point and didn't know how I'd gotten myself into such a bad situation so quickly. I am very small and not very strong, so it was easy for him to take control of me. He started driving, and I kept saying no, 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 and to stop, but he said, "Don't worry, I'm taking you somewhere safe," which was so scary. I had maps open, and we were driving out of Patong. Finally, after some time, I started telling him that I would throw up all over him and his car if he didn't pull over. This seemed to annoy him, and he pulled over. The second he stopped the car, I got out and ran down the street. Luckily, there was a motorbike taxi who asked if I needed a lift, and I jumped on and told him where my hotel was. I could see the guy walking down the road after we sped away. I made it back to my hotel safely. Honestly, after that, I'm not going to any bars or clubs alone. I don't trust anyone, especially when I'm feeling vulnerable. At least it was a lesson that I just need to be a lot more careful. I'm just glad I made it out okay. I was 9 when this happened. My sister, my dad, my stepmom and I were at a place called Palmetto Island. It was a camping resort where you just pull up with a tent or a camper and just stay there for a weekend or so. But before I get to the actual story, I should set the scene. Palmetto Island wasn't really an island in the traditional sense. It was completely surrounded by palm trees and vegetation, except for the road in and out. There were roads in the resort, and they were only for golf carts and other smaller vehicles. The whole place was also dense with palm trees and vegetation. If you were not on the road, in a campsite, or at one of the recreational areas, you would be in a forest. And now for the actual story. My family and I were all hanging at one of the only playgrounds. I had made a new friend who I was playing with. At some point, the rest of my family had left me to play with my new friend, until eventually he left too. I was there alone and the sun began to set. This wasn't the first time we'd been at Palmetto Island, and I had, at the time, known it pretty well. I'd assumed that the walk back to our campground would be short. However, at some point, I got turned around and ended up going where you would launch boats into the water and to go fishing. There was a group of people there, and I asked them for directions. Now, I wasn't completely stupid, so I lied and said that the number of our campsite was about 10 sites down from our actual site. They pointed me in the right direction, and I started walking. Now, I hadn't known this at the time, but my family had realized I was no longer at the playground, and started driving around in our golf carts, and another one that they had rented. If they hadn't, I probably wouldn't be telling this story. As I'm walking towards our campsite, a car pulls up and they unrolled the window. It was one of the people I asked directions from. Keep in mind, I've been walking for around an hour or 2 in total. He offered me a ride and told me I can ride in the front seat. Me, tired and weary from walking, accepts and get into the car. I know now that it was something I should never have done. We were driving in the right direction until he passed the entrance to the campsite. At this point, I knew something was wrong. I tell him he passed it, and he just didn't respond. By some stroke of divine luck, I see my dad in a golf cart driving in the opposite direction as us, and I started yelling and waving at him. He pulls up in front of the car and stops, and so does the guy driving. I used the manual unlock in the car door and ran to my dad, who had his conceal carry drawn on the guy as soon as I'm out of the way. He called the police and held the guy at gunpoint until they got there and arrested him. I'm only now telling this story because I found out last week that the guy and his whole family had done this before, and they'd gotten away with it. I try not to think about what would have happened to me if my dad had not shown up when he did,